Welcome, everyone, to the Christian Ghetto podcast. And just as a note, this will probably be the last of the podcasts that I do that's under the banner of the Christian Ghetto. We're going to be going forward from this point with the just the Seeking the Hidden Thing label. We're just kind of unifying my branding and all that on. And so to celebrate, maybe it's fitting to celebrate the end of the podcast that kind of got my podcasting started. We would talk about the state of South Africa with my friend Ernst van Zyl, Conscious Caracal. Welcome, Ernst. It's a pleasure to talk to you again.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me back, Kryptos. So there's always something to talk about when it comes to South Africa, but it seems in particular in 2025, people just can't get enough. There's just so much to cover, so much happening. It's been a absolute whirlwind of a year, but let's see where the conversation takes us. Let's see what topics we end up sticking on.
Yeah, and it's not like, I mean, South Africa has been in the news quite a bit. For those of us who are, pay attention to online discourse and
right,
the whole discussions around, the end of the West and how it comes next and how you can prepare and, parallelism and all of these subjects, we've turned to you and to others in South Africa because South Africa seems like a laboratory for all of these types of situations, whether it's, the decline of a once, world-class civilization to, how do you rebuild a thriving community when it gave away all of its power, all of these kinds of things. And so it's a very, South Africa just is an interesting place, and it's really nice to have folks like yourself who are willing to talk about it. So again, thank you for coming on. And I guess, this is just before we hit record, we were talking about your woes in getting back from Johannesburg to your home. And you were talking about, sort of the traffic in the city and just its general decay. And then you sort of said something that struck me as kind of interesting, that it isn't necessarily all decay, that there is a whole thriving class of people, both white and black, who are doing quite well in the midst of all of this decay. And maybe you can talk about that, because I think that's one thing that I hadn't really considered, is the idea of a burgeoning middle class that is built out of the current situation, which is really kind of interesting.
Right. So there's a fantastic account, just if you want to see the decay that's going on, particularly in a city like Johannesburg. On X, there's an account called Josie versus Josie, Josie being spelled Jozi. And when it comes to particularly that topic that you are touching on there, the class divide in South Africa, that's part of the story of the past 30 years. So when it comes to what are the characteristics, what are some of the key themes that come to the fore over the past 30 years, on the one side, you have chronic state failure, chronic state capacity decay, the government simply not being able to do basic goods and services that it's supposed to do, like water, electricity, security, and increasingly so. On the other side of that coin is the response, and the response is the increased first community-based solutions and then profit-based solutions. So on the one side, you have the community-based solutions, which uses a volunteer-based model. That's where AfriForum falls in, my organization. But then you have the private sector profit-motivated response, which is just as fascinating. Now, for example, South Africa has a flourishing private security sector. South Africa has more private security guards than military and police personnel combined. And when it comes to that class that we were talking about off air, the people that have insulated themselves from many of the problems affecting South Africa, a lot of them are opting not for community-based solutions, but for private sector solutions, profit-motivated solutions. Now, that's not the business where AfriForum is in, but it's still a fascinating part of the South African story. And some of those examples would be, what is the profit-motivated response to the load shedding that we're experiencing, the rolling blackouts for 17 years? Well, people are getting rooftop solar. I can't afford rooftop solar, but a lot of people can, where they're putting up solar panels on their rooftops, and that's heating their home, powering their home, often in a almost total way. I think in the past few years, the private citizens have built the equivalent of 2 coal power stations of just rooftop solar that they've put up in South Africa. So that's one of the private sector responses that we've seen. On the private security side, I've already touched on it. Private security in South Africa is incredibly cheap. You can buy or you can pay for top class, highly skilled and effective private security armed response to show up at your house if you press a panic button for a fee that is equivalent to a Spotify subscription fee in the United States. That's how cheap it has become in South Africa. On the other side, you also have the private sector filling almost all these gaps that the government is failing in. But at the same time, I don't think the profit driven solutions that I've described here really are the sustainable ones for the future. I think the sustainable solution that especially people on the outside need to be learning from, or especially the community-based solutions, because that's more organic. It's less compromisable by things like profit motive that can easily go awry or be corrupted. It has higher ideals that are driving it. But we've discussed that on your show many times. So I think that's just to sum up there. It's the fascinating response to state capacity decay is on the one side, there's actually a 3-pronged response. On the one side, you have the bad guys, literally organized crime filling the gap. Then you have communities filling the gap through community-based, volunteer-based solutions. And then you have the private sector also filling the gap through profit-based solutions. So those are the 3 factions fighting for supremacy in the gap that's being created in this through state capacity decay in South Africa.
And it's interesting you talk about that because it raises a theoretical question that a lot of people don't want to confront. In the West, where generally there's a high degree of social trust, and you have a high degree of social capacity across the society, we often are talking about, get the government out of things, just let private sector take care of things. This is especially an American theme. Let the private sector go, unleash the private sector, everything will be okay. And generally government is seen as an impediment to a high functioning society. And that when you look at it correctly, I think there are a lot of shared things that the government does that provide the infrastructure and context that allows the private sector to flourish. So there in a healthy society, you have this partnership between public and private. So, your tax dollars go to fund, large private works, roads, power infrastructure, a whole range of things, filling the potholes, picking up the trash. There's a whole range of stuff that can be done. And even some of those can be organized by the government, but then contracted out to private people. But there is this sense of this private public partnership. But there's that element that you mentioned there that when you lose a competent state that can wield violence competently, so police, military, and can maintain public order, and in the absence of that public order, that third group really rises up, where basically, in addition to competent, you might say like moral actors, who are like the private sector, who are above board and looking to do things relatively honestly. I mean, I'm sure there's a degree of corruption and so forth once, the state controls go off, and the ability of the state to wield violence, that then that third sector just seems like, once you say it, it seems obvious, but then the gangster element basically grows up to compete with the other two, because the other two can't restrain them, which is an interesting phenomenon. One I think that a lot of our people don't really think about fully. And you can think about, like, say, Chicago in the 1930s when gangsters ran Chicago. It's not that recent where these things were present in the West.
Yeah. And that element is suppressed by a powerful, competent state, that organized crime element to a large degree. Now, you have different case studies where, to different degrees, where that is the case. But in South Africa, for example, just as community-based solutions are thriving and private sector solutions are also thriving, like private security, organized crime is also thriving. It's one of the largest illegal industries or illegal sources of illegality in South Africa is organized crime. We have a mafia in almost every sector. We have a building mafia, a water mafia, every single sector in South Africa has some form of organized crime that has penetrated it and taken it over, or to a large extent has gotten a foothold there. So that's a very interesting and important point to be made, is the fact that, yes, when your government's capacity and strength and influence decays, there's room for the good guys to fill that gap, but the bad guys can see the opportunity as well.
Yeah, and that's kind of a strange, and like you mentioned, and it's not just like they're doing the usual crime things of, like theft, drugs, prostitution, that sort of thing. They're actually insinuating themselves into functions that you would normally think of as like state functions. So providing water, and all these other things that you were talking about, which is it's just
the
kind of
construction
fascinating.
mafia is the best and most fascinating case study in South Africa, where this organized crime syndicate just shows up at your construction site and says, if you don't let us build this building and give us the money to build this or do this construction, then we're not going to allow you to do it. You want to build a school? Two guys showed up, or some guys show up with AK-47s and tell you, no, you can't just build a school here. You have to contract us to build the school. Otherwise, we're not going to allow you to do it.
And as you say it, you can think about, say, the American context with the connections between the Teamsters and the construction industry, especially in places like New York and the Mafia. And so as you're describing that kind of story, it's so these things exist at the edges and as part of even first world civilized societies. So so it makes sense when you talk about this that as state capacity to effectively wield violence to maintain order decreases, that these types of mafia and organized crime elements would then begin to
organized violence. Yes.
Yeah.
Just a different form of it.
That's right. Exactly. So who do you want? And I think you've said this before, but it just never really stank in quite the way, who do you want in charge of your violence? Because once your state goes, it's not just the good guys.
I put it very simplistically, but like it can either be the good guys or the bad guys. It can either be your community, or it's going to be organized crime, or it's going to be the private sector.
And that really adds as you say, another whole layer of complexity to the decay in South Africa. Like one of the saddest things that I've seen is this notion that you used to have a thriving rail system and you can see all the rails, but the trains don't run in South Africa anymore.
Yeah, the railways themselves, the metal that it is made of is being stripped to be sold for scrap metal. So the railways, it reminds me of the story of old civilization, when new civilizations come across the ruins of an old civilization and they have no idea how it could have been built. They're like, oh, it must have been aliens or a race of giants that built it. Humans couldn't have built these amazing things. And I think maybe in the future, some descendants here in South Africa might find those railway lines, still the remnants of them, crisscross the landscape, and ask, what were these? Well, no, they were probably some ancient race of aliens that used them for some type of extraterrestrial ends. We can't possibly know. It's indecipherable.
And it's kind of frightening to think, but we're a lot closer to that than many people realize. Like you say, 30 years since the end of apartheid, right. And this is basically what South Africa has become. So you think to yourself that if you think that that's not possible in other Western countries, it entirely is. And I think the blessing of civilization is a very fragile thing. And I think people don't realize how fragile sometimes.
Right. And it's that saying, or it's now become a saying, but it started off as an article that complex systems will not survive the competency crisis. Well, the state is a complex system. So you can take that as either good news or bad news, because I know a lot of people in the West are like, man, you guys do a lot of interesting and phenomenal stuff there in South Africa, but my government here in my Western country would never allow me to do that. But then I told them, well, then the good news for you is that the state is a complex system, and complex systems will not survive the competency crisis. But as we've now covered so far in this conversation, there's a lot of bad that comes with it as well, with a power vacuum being created. There's a lot of risks and many costs that come with it as well.
Yeah, and society, like just little things like just routine maintenance of streets, roads, and rails. Maintaining the electrical grid, clean water, sewage,
crime prevention,
crime prevention, and so, as you mentioned, that people are increasingly living in gated communities, and I kind of joked and I said, "So are these basically mostly like white communities now that have retreated to these gated communities?" He said, "Absolutely not." He says, "There's actually the black middle class and upper class is actually larger than the white population," which is sort of like, if you think about it, given that the population size should make sense. But maybe you can talk about for a few minutes just sort of who makes up this burgeoning and developing black middle and upper class.
Right. So South Africa is not a story, as some might simplistically reduce it to, as just there's a rich white population and a poor black population. South Africa, over the past 30 years, a lot has changed. I mean, there already were wealthy black South Africans even before the fall of apartheid. But I mean, the black middle class has really grown in the past 30 years to the point where it is it's larger than the entire white population combined. Now, I would argue that the black middle class in South Africa has grown despite many of the destructive policies of the government, not thanks to many of the destructive and discriminatory policies of the government. I mean, South Africa still has a 40% unemployment rate. But when it comes to particularly that middle class in South Africa, if you were to look at where they're employed, a lot of them are employed by the state. A lot of them are bureaucrats. A lot of them are employed by this massive bureaucratic machine called the South African government that's only been growing and growing and growing since 1994. So not exclusively, but a large portion of them are getting their money from a job working for the government, which was where a lot of Afrikaners used to get their income during apartheid. During apartheid, a large portion of Afrikaners were employed by the state. But then after the fall of apartheid, all these Afrikaner employees of the state were systematically purged, and they were replaced by this newer, what is now the black middle class to a large extent. Now, like I said, not all of them are employed by the state, but a large proportion of them are. But many of them have also made their fortunes in the private sector. There is also a class, and that's the middle class, but then there's also a very incredibly wealthy class in South Africa of all races, particularly those with the right political connections to government or working for a company that gets government contracts. You can only get government contracts in South Africa if you have the right racial makeup, or if you qualify for these racial criteria of the government that totally don't exist. But even if they did exist, it would be a good thing. You know how the narrative goes. That's the situation. So those people especially the upper class of South Africa are buying their first world existence to a large extent. They still have to drive on roads that are bad quality. Often they still have to go out to the shopping mall or wherever, and there is the risk of crime. But their neighborhoods are safe. They're living in very high security gated communities. And a large portion of this top 1% of South Africa did engage in some very despicable behavior the past few months, when Donald Trump made his initial post talking about simply the very bad things happening in South Africa, became a bit of a social trend among the top 1% in South Africa, particularly the white liberal demographic, to post videos on social media of them lounging next to their luxurious pools, walking around in their palace houses, strolling in the gardens, there in their golf estates, their high security golf estates. All making these videos with a caption with a variant of the caption, very bad things are happening in South Africa, mocking Donald Trump, saying, how can you say there are bad things happening in South Africa? Look at me, I'm white and I'm sipping a mimosa next to my beautiful swimming pool the size of a middle class home. So that's also something fascinating that was happening here in South Africa the past few months, was a real bona fide let them eat cake moment from the upper class here in response to Donald Trump.
That's just kind of bizarre, because that's one thing that I've heard you mention elsewhere, that not everyone who is, in terms of the politics, that there's a significant, in a sense, almost true believer leftist crowd among middle and upper middle class whites who benefit from the system and the way things are and still do very well, but are very, very committed to the kind of, radical left-wing policies that you think, it's only these Marxist blacks that are doing this.
Right, and they are the demographic that you often see the ethnomasochists among as well. People that love projecting to the world how much their collective race deserves to be punished or deserves to be discriminated against or even deserves to be murdered in some cases. It really is
almost
sipping
mimosas by the pool.
Absolutely. While posting photographs of their mountaintop view of their home, saying, how can you possibly say there are human rights abuses happening in South Africa? How's that possible if I can sit here eating caviar?
Which is just like, it's just bizarre. And
now, how bizarre do you think that it's bizarre to you as an outsider looking in? Now, just imagine how bizarre that is to someone who lives in the real world in South Africa, and hearing people who live in the same or alleged to live in the same country as you. I struggle to believe that they live in the same country as me, listening to some of the things they say. But imagine how bizarre it is to me and the rest of us plebs who live in the real world, South Africa, and you see your fellow countrymen tell you there's nothing wrong. What are you talking about? Everything is fine. Race laws? What race laws?
Now, is this a sense, an exercise where they believe that in saying these things, it grants them a degree of immunity from, that the eye of Sauron, so to speak, turns away from them, and because it's turned away from them, they can kind of pretend that it doesn't exist?
There's a fascinating piece written by James Myburgh on Politics Web, a South African website. He's an investigative journalist and political analyst. I'm not going to read the piece. I'm just going to get the title here. It's called Flight, Freeze, Fawn, or Fight: How to Interpret Minority Responses to Racial Nationalist Aggression in South Africa. So he pretty much details what are we witnessing here, the different survival strategies, as you would put it there. So one of these strategies is definitely the fawn strategy of saying, well, if I feed the crocodile, at least I'm not going to be eaten, or at the very least I'm going to be eaten last. But I don't think they really see it that way. I think most of them just think appeasement is the right approach. So that's the one. Yeah, quote unquote survival strategy. You see a lot of this logic. It's a bit of a silly example, but you see a lot of this logic with people who say, I'm nice to my ChatGPT AI because the day that the AI robots take over, they're not going to kill me because they know they'll say, oh, you were nice to me. You said please and thank you to the robot. Now, enough about the mental illness that's going on there. So when it particularly comes to these survival strategies, one is the fawn strategy, as I just said. Then there's also the strategy of being genuinely a true believer, people that genuinely believe in this race nationalist view of the ANC, this discrimination regime, thinking that this is all justified, we all deserve it. It should be how things are. Those true believers are throughout media, academia in South Africa. You find them a lot, but also in the upper class, because they are shielded from a lot of these discriminatory policies, a lot of the state failures. They can all afford solar panels on their roof. They can all afford top class security. They can all afford living in a Gulf estate. Then there's also, but this is more of a fascinating psychological thing that's going on. This is my own interpretation of what I think also is happening here, is it's luxury beliefs to a large extent, where just as the peacock has a large tail to signal to females that even with this incumbent, I can still be the most beautiful bird in the garden or the most attractive mate. A lot of these high profile, these high status individuals are signaling their status as well by saying, I am so wealthy, I can believe in all these, I can proclaim and support and champion all of these destructive policies, is a way of signaling your privilege, a way of signaling your status, signaling your wealth. You can, in literally and figuratively, afford to believe in all of these absurdities and champion and support these absurd and destructive policies, because you have enough money to shield yourself from the outcomes and to shield yourself from the negative outcomes that flow from them. But that's a bit more of an interesting, just little psychological thought that I had on what might be going on here. I have no empirical proof, or I didn't do my PhD or whatever in this subject. And then the last one that James Myburgh also touches on is the flight response, where many of South Africa's richest people, or people in the upper class and middle class in South Africa, have left the country over the years, particularly white South Africans, fleeing discrimination, fleeing violence, fleeing scapegoating, being made made to blame for every single government failure, and fleeing chants like Kill the Boore, Kill the Farmer. There's a massive diaspora community of Afrikaners outside of South Africa, for example. So those are some of the things that you're seeing going on here. I don't think there's one size that fits all, one explanation that explains it all, but I think if you take that collection of explanations together, I think it paints a pretty accurate picture.
And it's interesting that you mentioned like that many in the middle class are supported through direct government work and government contracts, and that there is then, those that are wealthy enough to shield themselves from the conflicts. But somebody has, like, the revenues have to be coming from somewhere, right? So there has to still be real economic activity in South Africa. And as you mentioned, there's the growing black middle class. Now, they're not entirely sustained by the government. So there must be a mixture of both whites and blacks who are doing real economic activity in South Africa.
Right. But, the tax base, or the tax picture in South Africa is not looking good at all. So, just about 900,000 South Africans, or 1.5% of the population, pay 60% of all personal income tax. So it's a tiny, tiny little slither of society that almost single-handedly carries the entire state's expenses. The rest is being pretty much a large portion, an increasingly large portion, is then being funded by debt, government debt. There's a reason why South Africa's economic growth over the past 10 years has just been like a pathetic, measly little between 0 and 1%, just there, between 0.5 and 1.5% at the most.
So I guess the question, and because these are, everybody, I think people are curious and they want to know. Now, of that top 1% then who are paying for 60% of the thing, I would assume, and that would be, I think most people outside of South Africa, that the majority of those are from the white population left over from the days of apartheid. Is that correct?
Well, I don't have the numbers.
Is that changing?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I would say it is definitely disproportionately white. I think that would be in dispute, undeniable. But at the same time, it is changing. As I said, there is a burgeoning black middle class in South Africa, and there is a growing portion of black income tax paying members of South Africa, of the South African population as well. But there would definitely be a disproportionate amount of white taxpayers. I think that's pretty clear.
Now that would make sense. I mean, just, you think about it, that in any population group, even if characteristically they differ, from in terms of different ethnic and racial groups, that there would be a segment of the population who are still highly competent and high functioning. And these people in the end are likely going to do well. And so it's not surprising that they're there. It's just sometimes we don't, you get so locked into the narratives that get fed down to, from apartheid, that, you have this wealthy, group of whites that are basically sitting on these poor beleaguered blacks and exploiting them. Right. And that's not entirely the case, and wasn't even necessarily during apartheid.
But I mean, when it comes to particularly that history in the past 30 years, I think that's one of the things that definitely defines the past 30 years is the growth of that black middle class. It wasn't a large factor within the South African context during apartheid. But at the same time, largely that growth is due to things not due to the racially discriminatory policies of the South African government, but rather despite them, rather due to other opportunities that came to the fore, other opportunities, free market opportunities, rather than particularly the government playing a large role there. The only real role that the government can say that it definitively played in building that black middle class post-apartheid was creating a massive amount of state jobs for black South Africans, just creating an ocean of state-sponsored jobs that the government can claim, definitely.
Yeah, and I know you've mentioned this before, but for many who don't understand that black is not a monolithic concept in South Africa. There's like dozens of tribal elements, several dominant ones, and from what I understand is anytime the government shifts, even if the party name stays the same, when the different tribal elements come to dominate the party and then thus the government, that there is sweeping purges where those who are from a different tribe are let go and the people from your tribe are installed in positions. And so your fortunes within the government can depend very much on which tribe
really
you
much
belong to.
depend. Yeah, it can really much depend on tribal allegiance and the tribal lines and the cultural allegiance. So that's still also a major factor in South Africa is culture and ethnicity, and identity in South Africa is a lot deeper than just race. It goes gets a lot more complex than that. That's why I keep reminding people on the outside, South Africa is not for beginners. Just take it easy when you're diving into this absolute just whirlwind of a case study, a political science case study. It's going to be tricky. You're going to be frustrated at times.
Yeah, because there's a fairly steep learning curve. The Zulus are not in charge right now, if I remember right.
No, they are. There's a fascinating part of the political puzzle as well. I mean, the Zulus are probably they are the most powerful demographic in South Africa, most powerful cultural demographic in regards to their political influence. I mean, they have their own piece of South Africa that almost is on the border of operating like an ethno-state, the Ingonyama Trust, where it's almost exclusively just Zulus living there. And the tribal authorities there have major authority over the people that live there. I mean, the Zulu king lives there and he has massive authority. When it comes to particularly who is in charge in South Africa, well, unfortunately, to the detriment of everyone in South Africa, the ruling elite in South Africa are these deracinated, just completely cultureless urbanites and metropolitans. The president of South Africa doesn't appear to have a cultural bone in his body. He just seems to be this urbanite, this deracinated urbanite. The ANC is not a culture-friendly party. There are cultural lines that define factions within the party, but these are heavily watered down. They often clash with traditional authorities in South Africa, with the ANC being the new elite that pretty much if you zoom out in the bigger picture, the new ANC elite pretty much replaced the traditional leader black elite that used to be the elite within that society for hundreds of years. The new elite in black culture today are the politicians rather than the traditional leaders. The traditional leaders still hold a lot of influence and power, but it is an influence and power that the government is constantly limiting, chipping away at, and constantly replacing with this more deracinated elite that don't really care about culture, that actually are often their actions and their policies are actually diametrically opposed to promoting the different cultures and languages of South Africa. That's why they don't care about developing the different languages of South Africa. They rather just anglicize the entire country because they don't care about language. They don't care about different cultures. They only care about how they can consolidate their power in the hands of the state. I mean, they in typical Marxist fashion, there's not a lot of room for the different instruments in the orchestra of God, as MP van Wyk Louw described the different cultures and ethnicities and languages of the world. In the statist's mind, in the communist's mind, everything needs to be subverted and smashed down into just this gray goo that's easier to manipulate and easier to administrate, because the state, it's easier for the state machine to just to operate in that fashion.
Yeah, wow. It like you say, it's South Africa is not necessarily for beginners. And even I find I've probably learned more than most. And even I find myself every time I talk with you, I learn something new. Now, one of the things that's brought South Africa again into the news is this group of what is about 50 total or 50 families of South Africans refugees that came to the United States.
I constantly see conflicting reports whether it's 50 families or 50 individuals, but let's go with 50 individuals just for argument's sake.
Sure.
I stand to be corrected, but it is from what I can see and from what I've read, it seems to be about 50 individuals, but it might be 50. It might not include children or whatever, but because there seems to be conflicting reports. But yeah, let's just settle on 50 individuals.
So what tipped off? I mean, like, as you say, Afrikaners and Anglo South Africans have been leaving South Africa now for the last 30 years. What makes this, in terms of recent events, this group of 50 significant in terms of, like, I mean, they came into the news, Donald Trump gave them refugee status, but what makes this group sort of different or unique from others? Or maybe there is nothing unique about them. It's just that they happen to be in the news this week.
No, what makes them unique is the fashion in which they arrive and the circumstances under which they arrived in America. So firstly, the executive order that Donald Trump signed and his proclamations and rhetoric around it. What Donald Trump did in 2025 was something historic for one single reason, one main reason, and that is, I went and checked. He is the first American president to acknowledge the Afrikaner culture in a positive way. I've not found on an international stage. I've not found a single other example of an American president acknowledging the Afrikaner culture in a positive way in history. So that's already a groundbreaking element that's at play here. The second thing that's incredibly important to recognize is the fact that these Afrikaners arrive not as immigrants, but as refugees, because as refugees, it legitimizes the cause that there is something being done to these people. There's something that they're fleeing from. A cause that has been denied for decades now in South Africa, and not just in South Africa. You saw it in your own media the past week as well. Just absolute denialism. Farm murders aren't happening. Race laws aren't happening. All these destructive, horrible things, these bad things that Donald Trump is referencing, none of those are happening. That was the status quo for the past 30 years. And only now, recently, that's why, even though it's just 50 people, it makes global news. It makes front page news because of the symbolism of it. It shatters that paradigm. It penetrates that containment for the first time of the narrative, where it comes to the fact that now the truth about South Africa is a lot more out in the open. And the meeting that we saw in the Oval Office recently was just another cracking open, a further unleashing of the truth, where the president of South Africa and his delegation were used to just the red carpet being rolled out for them. They'd go into an interview. If they were ever asked about something uncomfortable in South Africa, their explanations for why that is the case would just be accepted blindly. So, for example, they would be asked in an interview, we hear about farm murders in South Africa. Can you tell us a bit more about that? And the president of South Africa would say, and this is a direct quote, there are no murdering of farmers or white farmers in South Africa. And then the journalist or politician would be like, oh, thank you very much for clarifying and clearing that up. That was not the case in the Oval Office. We can talk, if you want to go do a little bit more of a detailed analysis on what went on there, we can do that. But just to circle back to your initial question, those are the two main things that make these refugees significant. On the one side is the acknowledgement of Donald Trump, the positive acknowledgement, the first time in history by a president of the United States of the Afrikaner culture and Afrikaner group as a people, the Afrikaner folk. And then secondly is the fact that the nature of which these people arrive in the United States. They arrive as refugees, and that legitimizes the fact that they are the reality that they are fleeing from something real.
It is interesting the way well, and we can talk in a minute about the delegation visit with Donald Trump, but I think that's a really, really significant point, because so much of the news and the narrative gets locked into this oppressor-oppressed binary that and dialectic. And as you say, the Afrikaner has been painted for the last 30 years and longer as, the oppressor. And so you have this thing of, like, whatever's happening in South Africa, the Afrikaner just has to kind of shut up and mind his P's and Q's, because he's the oppressor. And as you say, if you're bringing in 50 refugees, you're signaling to the world that the Afrikaner is no longer the oppressor. In this context, he is now beleaguered and oppressed. And
Right.
I think that's very, very hard, even though like socioeconomically, the Afrikaner is often doing very well. They're doing very well in spite of the fact that they're being oppressed.
That's another critical point, because that's one of the dismissals that you hear. People say, well, there's still Afrikaners doing relatively well in South Africa. Yes, despite what is being done to them. Is the way that a people or an individual is treated only legitimate or only recognized as wrong when it has its desired outcome? For example, if a people are designated to be discriminated against by the government, is that action only wrong when those people are discriminated into poverty? Is it then only wrong if they find ways around the discrimination, if they find ways to not, for example, ways around it would be that you don't, for example, then focus your entire education on going to work for the state. If you know that the state is going to discriminate against you and not give you a job, well, then white South Africans and Afrikaners in particular post 1994 went into the private sector, saying, well, there's no future for Afrikaners to work for the state, so we're going to go into the private sector, which actually made a lot of Afrikaners more wealthy. But that doesn't mean that the discrimination that forced them and the purging of Afrikaners out of the state service, that is then no longer wrong just because they found an alternative source of income that proved to actually be quite effective. It still makes the initial action wrong. So when it comes to particularly this refugee status thing, that's why it also upsets so many people, because if the narrative is true, that Afrikaners are all living in large in South Africa, they all live massively privileged lives, incredibly luxurious, fantastic lives, why would they flee from that?
Yeah, it really is. It breaks like a number of different frames, as you say, that not all oppressed are like, poor and living on the streets or being thrown into prisons or whatever.
You often adapt to the
you can be
injustice
wealthy
that's
and
being
oppressed
done to
too.
you.
Yeah. Well, and like there's all of the different layers in terms of and maybe we'll get to that after the Donald Trump thing, but there's all these layers of capacity that the Afrikaner community has built up because the state isn't doing it, and has been deemed necessary for their survival as a people,
right.
Which I think is, and this is one of the reasons why the Afrikaner story is so interesting to us, but then it complicates the narrative for many in the West who like their story, like the narrative to be nice and simple, oppressed people are always poor and beleaguered. Well, no, oppressed people are not always poor and beleaguered, but that doesn't necessarily make them any less oppressed.
The best example as well is oppression through violence or incitement of violence, where if there are politicians that are chanting about inciting violence to murder a particular, kill a particular group of people, if that group of people then drastically increase the amount of defensive organization that they do, the amount of private security that they have, the amount of safety measures that they implement, does that then suddenly just nullify the fact that politicians are chanting about their murder? No, it just shows that group has effectively responded to the aggression, has effectively, or at least to a large extent, effectively responded to the targeting by those that are wanting to see them killed. It doesn't make the chanting and the incitement, chanting "kill the Boer, kill the farmer," inconsequential just because the victims responded effectively.
Well, yeah, and as somebody, as somebody of Dutch descent who grew up around farmers and farming, and still has several uncles who are farmers, the idea of "kill the Boer" is, as you said, it rings very close to home. It's one of, I can't imagine the constant anxiety that you live under of not knowing when some murderous gang is going to show up on your, at the borders of your property. And I can't imagine living like that constantly of one, and will the security groups get here in time to save us and to respond, because they can't be everywhere all at once. It's just,
just to show the severity, just from my own personal side, this morning I got a call from one of my friends. His family-in-law were attacked on their farm last night. God bless, luckily nobody was killed, but they were tied up and assaulted very badly. And that's
Oh my word.
that's the reality.
Yeah, and this is an ongoing regular story among the Afrikaner
Like I said,
community.
I can give you an example from this morning from someone that I know very closely.
Yeah, and to think about that, okay, yes, you're all things considered, they're probably a relatively successful farmer and they're doing well in all other respects, but their lives are never going to be the same after this.
No.
Like you never really go back to normal. You're always going to be looking over your shoulder, wondering if another attack is going to come. Are we going to be safe? I'm going to lose my children. Am I going to come home to find, what am I going to come home today when I go into town? Living under that is, it's got to be hard.
Yeah, but I mean, in South Africa, people have responded through just upping the amount of security that they have. Now, not everyone can afford that security, unfortunately. But I mean, that still comes down to that central point. Just because your victim was able to do effective self-defense doesn't mean that the perpetrator is then let off the hook. That doesn't mean that the person inciting that violence is then no longer guilty. Just because he is making these types of incitements of violence to kill a certain group, and then that group effectively defends itself to a large extent, that doesn't nullify the fact that politicians are chanting about murdering farmers and minorities in South Africa. And that's why this meeting between Donald Trump and Ramaphosa was so effective. I mean, it's so funny. I mean, when I went on a panel discussion on the largest Afrikaans TV channel in South Africa 2 days before this meeting between Donald Trump and Ramaphosa. I was on this panel. The 3 other people on the panel were very much government apologists. I was the only one really giving an alternative view. And one of the comments that I made was, I said, how will the South African government respond, or this delegation respond, if Donald Trump pulls out photographs? If he comes prepared with a video. Now, what I meant was, I didn't think he was going to make it an entire cinematic experience. I thought he maybe pull out his phone. I thought maybe he pulls out his phone, plays a grainy video with bad sound, and that's going to be embarrassment enough. Maybe show some photographs. But Donald Trump came to that meeting prepared. He seems to have gone to every person that has a tiny little shred of connection to South Africa and asked them, tell me, what can you tell me about this country? And he came there, and what he did was, there's also, again, very strong symbolic value there in regards to this delegation, the South African delegation that sat there smirking, squirming, not knowing what to do. They have been deniers of all these things happening in South Africa for so long. And all that Donald Trump did was, one moment, I'm just going to lock these people in a room and force them to watch what's happening in their own country. And what did they do? They wouldn't even look at the screen. They refused to look at the screen. They laughed, they fidget, they didn't know what to do. And in the end, one of the most embarrassing moments, I couldn't believe what I saw, was when Donald Trump showed a video of a farm murder protest in South Africa, the one with the crosses next to the road.
Yes.
I remember that protest is from 2020. It is a real protest. It really happened. It's not AI. It's not from the Congo. It's not some fake video. It's one of the largest anti-farm murder protests in the history of South Africa. It was plastered all over social media. Everyone knew about it. When that video was played, unedited, it's just an unedited aerial view of the protest. South African president looks at the video, he looks at Trump, and he's like, where is this? And Donald Trump looks at him, the president of the United States, and tells him, this is South Africa, my friend. And I just think to myself, there's only 2 options here. Either the president is lying, that he is aware of this protest, which he has to be. It happened during his presidency. There's a banner if you look at the end of the video, there's a banner that was erected over the road that addresses Ramaphosa directly, that asks him, Ramaphosa, how many more murders will it take? And he's either lying, saying that he doesn't know about this protest, even though he does, or he's genuinely oblivious about what's happening in his own country. I don't know what's worse for a president of the country.
And it's crazy and the name of the gentleman who's with the Kill the Boore chants. What's his name again?
Julius Malema.
That's right, Malema. And I'm thinking to myself, if a rally like that happened in North America or Europe,
in Yankee Stadium,
even with the racial politics that is here, they would get arrested for incitement. Like there's no way that you could ignore that if you put that on television, and you got a whole stadium of people, you whip them into a furor, kill the whitey. Mm-hmm. I mean, I couldn't imagine, like, the fact that he's still walking around free is just mind-boggling.
It's even worse. What makes it worse is the fact that the president of South Africa can't even bring himself to condemn the chant. Because, I mean, there's two things at play here. On the one side, he can hide behind the fact that, the constitutional court in South Africa said that the chant is not hate speech or is not illegal. Okay, fine. Let's take that then, that it's not illegal. That doesn't mean that it's not wrong. That doesn't mean that you can't condemn it in the strongest terms and say you don't support this at all, and that anyone who chants that you condemn anyone who makes that chant. No, he can't do that. When AfriForum wrote him a letter earlier this year, when that chant was done on Human Rights Day in 2025, AfriForum wrote a letter to the president. We got a response, and in that letter we asked, the very least that you can do is condemn this chant in no uncertain terms. And his spokesperson responded by saying the president will do no such thing. And then Donald Trump cornered him, and when he had nowhere to run, when he had nowhere to hide, and he didn't have a media apparatus at his disposal that runs cover for him and is basically his own little PR company or PR industrial complex, then he lied. Then he's like, we've always condemned this. We don't support this. I've never supported this. I've always condemned it. No, you haven't. He's never condemned that chant. The moment he landed back in South Africa yesterday, he said that he strongly defends the chant once again in front of all the cameras. Once he was back on home soil, once he was no longer being cornered by Donald Trump, when he was no longer being grilled in front of the global media, he strongly once again came out in support of that chant of kill the Boer, kill the farmer. Absolute two-faced, just forked tongue response. You can't trust this guy. He will just say whatever he needs to say to hang on to power, and he will support any inhuman policy and chants or whatever and rhetoric that he must to hang on to power. That's Cyril Ramaphosa. And then there's this other argument as well, where I see a lot of people in your media were like, this is just a 10% party. What are you talking about? This is not a real threat. Why are people overreacting? And I just wonder, if the Kill All Minorities Party had one seat in your Senate, what would your media say?
Yeah, it would be. It would. I mean, it would be. Yeah.
Oh, it's just one seat. It's just one Senate seat. What are you freaking out about? Yes, they are calling for the slaughter of minorities, but it's just one seat in the Senate. I mean, no, they wouldn't be saying that. No, they would be saying this needs immediate action and these people belong in jail.
Well, and this is the thing though, right? Is that there is a whole segment of both in South Africa and across the globe that will make the argument, like you say, it's not happening, but if it were happening, it would be a good thing. And then the final one, and you deserve it. Right. And so I think there is a segment of a large portion of the media that look at what is happening to the Afrikaner and see it as a form of justice.
That's definitely what's happening in the South African media. And I can imagine it's happening in the American media as well. But I mean, at the end of the day, once you give these issues a human face, once you really show people the realities happening in South Africa, it becomes very difficult to make that claim. And I mean, that's what Donald Trump did to a large extent, is actually showing the reality on screen. Dim the lights. Let me show you unedited footage about what's happening in your country. That was an absolute just devastating move, because the only response the South African delegation had was, don't believe your lying eyes. Look away from the screen. Don't look at the screen. Avert your eyes.
Which is just wild. And knowing that...
But they've been getting away with it for 30 years. So are you really surprised that that's what they just
I'm not.
back on old tactics?
Well, it is interesting because this kind of dovetails back to sort of what maybe wind up things a little bit in terms of discussion, but it kind of loops back to this, to the understanding that, the criminal element grows in South Africa and becomes a real force, in part because the state cannot wield effective violence to maintain order. Mm-hmm. So from my understanding is that a lot of the violence that's happening on the farms, although there is political incitement, that much of the violence is criminal in nature.
Well, there's the highly organized nature of farm murders. If you look at some of the technology that some of these farm murders have, they're not just some disgruntled farm worker or some random person that's hungry for a piece of bread. These are highly organized in many cases. So there's definitely an organized crime element of it. I mean, the farm murder picture is a complex one. Not all of it is directly related to government or incitement by politicians. Not all of it is directly related to particularly chants like Kill the Boore. Many of it is, but at the same time, it's very difficult to put an exact number on it because no farm murderer is going to stand in court and testify that he did it out of pure hatred or did it because of a chant that told him to do it, because then he's going to get triple the sentence. He's going to say, oh, I did it because of all these circumstances outside of my control, because then his sentence is going to be lowered. So it's very difficult to get to the core of the motives behind some of these attacks. You can deduce the motives by the amount of torture that's happening, but the clear admissions in court are very few and far between, because those criminals know if you go into that court and you testify you did it out of pure hatred and you feel no remorse, then you're going to get the maximum sentence.
So that it makes, so there's a criminal portion to it, but there's also just simply a kind of a political and racial that. And now,
like I said, unfortunately, to put a number on either in regards to what portion is just simply criminal, what portion is directly race hate, it's not near impossible. It is impossible at the moment. The data just isn't there. But so I gather, you can make a very educated guess based on the nature of many of these attacks.
So I gather, and so I gather nobody's really done that or have been able to do or to ascertain, are these actually state sponsored or are they done through surrogates?
It's an incredibly difficult thing because, like I said, nobody's going to admit to it. Even if it was true, nobody's going to admit it because that's going to have direct implications for their sentence.
Yeah, and so this I think leads maybe to where we can kind of wind things down, but sort of what happens next with the Afrikaner community? It's one of these things, as you say, you have these options. You can, fight or flight, right? Or appease, I guess, right? So fight, flight, or appease. And I think knowing the temperament of most, of people with Dutch ancestry, appeasement doesn't generally seem to be something that we're willing to do. So your options are more or less leave or fight. And is there? I guess one of the things that I've tried to wrap my head around too. Would there be, say, compared to something like the Palestinian situation? Would there be a possibility? Is there enough contiguous land where the Boers could and the Afrikaner could retreat and say, fight for an Afrikaner state kind of thing? Or is it really that you're sort of spread out enough that really isn't a realistic option? I'm just trying to grasp sort of what is the road forward for the Afrikaner?
So firstly, the road forward, there's a lot of uncertainty, but what is definitely a certainty is that it's going to be a dualistic existence between the cultural core community in Southern Africa and then the diaspora community, which is hundreds of thousands outside of South Africa. Now, those hundreds of thousands are those that have immigrated over the past few decades. But as I've explained previously, I think on your show as well, Afrikaner culture cannot survive as exclusively a diaspora people. The diaspora is dependent on the cultural core in South Africa to be able to feed it to support these satellites, the mothership, if you want to put it very crudely. So in the end, that is the future, that loosely what we're going to see with Afrikaner existence for the foreseeable future is that dualistic existence between diaspora community and then cultural core in South Africa. What the cultural core is going to have to do to be robust and survive and thrive, well, that's also going to have to be many different facets. On the one side, it's going to entail larger demographic concentration because Afrikaners are incredibly widely spread out all across South Africa. There's not one part of South Africa where Afrikaners are the majority. We are everywhere. We are a minority. So, but that process is already happening organically, as unfortunately it's a positive byproduct of a sad process. So the sad, tragic process is the decay and destruction of small town South Africa, rural South Africa, all these small little towns, these one church towns. They are falling apart. They can't keep up. They are decaying into dust, which means that there is a massive semi-migration happening of Afrikaners to larger towns and cities in the area. So large towns are growing larger and cities are growing larger. Pretoria being one of the city where I live is one of the cities where Afrikaners are congregating. So Afrikaners are already demographically concentrating in about between 20 and 30 main areas. So greater demographic concentration is going to be absolutely critical. And the next step then is to create a stronger network with between those demographic concentrations. So Afrikaners, I don't think, are ever going to concentrate in one place in South Africa. Even if you were to give them like a demarcated spot in the country, say, this is your little country now, here's your little border, you all can go live there, but you have to go there willingly. The Afrikaners won't all go live there. Some might go there. Not the majority actually won't. The majority will. It's a complex thing. It really comes down to people being tied to their parts of South Africa often, and just packing up and leaving and going to live somewhere where there's nothing. That's also a big sacrifice. That is also something that's not as much easier said than done. For example, the town of Urania, which is the Afrikaner town with 3,000 people at this point, nothing is stopping all of Afrikaners going to live there in that town. But, there are many factors that make it difficult to go live there. It takes a long time to build a house. It's quite expensive. Some products there. It's a lot of sacrifices that you have to make to go live there in the middle of the desert. But the fact that only 3,000 have gone to live there shows that Afrikaners, it's not as simple as just giving Afrikaners one spot and then they all go live there. So that dualistic existence internally in South Africa is also going to continue, not dualistic existence, but multifaceted existence, where Afrikaners are going to be concentrating in different parts, both urban and rural, in large towns and cities. And that's the reality for the foreseeable future, which means that any solutions for Afrikaners have to take that into account. So the Urania movement model is that they have identified a geographic area and they're going to be concentrating in that specific one area. That's fine. That's their strategy. The solidarity movements and the AfriForum's approach is well right. That there's the Urania movement strategy, but there also needs to be a strategy for the majority of Afrikaners that are going to be living outside of that one point, that one central point that Urania has identified as almost the nucleus, as a little center. And what we're doing is the solution for all of those Afrikaners on the outside is community organization, and particularly community organization and building of our own institutions within those places where Afrikaners are concentrating naturally and organically demographically, because you're not going to be able to do anything artificially here. You're going to have to adapt to the organic tendencies and patterns that are unfolding around you. Demographics is an incredibly difficult thing to direct and manipulate. So the realistic strategies are ones that adapt to how demographics are shifting, rather than trying to do the Titanic thing of actually controlling how these demographic shifts are happening. You're just a crude remark in Afrikaans goes, you're farting against thunder.
Yeah. So then the Afrikaner community, as it's kind of spread out in multiple centers around thing too, I gather then that you live in some ways almost like separate ghettos in some sense. Ghetto is kind of a pejorative, but my understanding then is that for the most part, Afrikaners tend to band together. So you have separate schools, right?
And I can put it this way, that they are cities and neighborhoods and regions where Afrikaners congregate, where there is a disproportionate amount of Afrikaners.
Okay.
But there aren't any neighborhoods that are exclusively Afrikaner, or towns except Urania that are exclusively Afrikaner, or regions that are exclusively Afrikaner. But there are places where demographically Afrikaners are concentrated and disproportionately to the total population represented.
Like, so in this particular area or this portion of this city, we're a majority where we are, but not exclusive. And I gather that would then
not a majority. That's actually the critical point. There's nowhere in South Africa where Afrikaners are the majority. There might be some neighborhoods where they are the majority, but there's no town or city where Afrikaners are the majority.
Okay, that's right. So then,
except Urania.
Except Urania. So then really you're, like a neighborhood within a city where within this neighborhood we're predominant, but and I gather that having those types of geographic ties, even within a city, do make providing mutual aid easier. That's having somewhat of a
demographic concentration, yes, living in proximity, yes.
And that's
so. For example, that's what we took into account when we built Saltec. When we built our Afrikaans Technical College, we built it close to where one of the largest concentrations of Afrikaners live in the city of Pretoria.
That would make sense.
And so we built it in the city of Pretoria, which is the city with the largest Afrikaner population in South Africa.
So just to kind of get people an idea, okay, how big is Pretoria?
Sure. Off the top of my head, I know there's about 500,000 Afrikaners that live in Pretoria, but Pretoria's population varies depending on where you draw the borders of the city. So unfortunately, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. But I don't even want to guess because I'm going to get it horribly wrong. But I know there's 500,000 Afrikaners living here.
So you're about 20-30% of the population in Pretoria.
If you'll indulge a guess that might be completely wrong, I would guess that Afrikaners are somewhere in the region of between 40 and 60% of the city.
Okay, in Pretoria, that gives you kind of an idea.
But then, also depending on where you draw the borders.
But that does give you a significant concentration, and that concentration then does allow you to, provide mutual aid and support for each other. Now from there, I mean, there's still a significant portion of the Afrikaner population that are involved in the farming industry. Now that's dwindling though, right?
Yes, with the increased automation, notwithstanding all the security threats and everything else, yes, the amount of commercial farmers in South Africa is decreasing drastically. But the Afrikaner ties to agriculture are still going strong. The disproportionate ties between Afrikaner culture and the Afrikaner community and agriculture are going to remain. That's the fact that the synonym for Afrikaners is Boer, the farmers, that tells you everything you need to know. That intimate connection between that industry and our people is going to remain, even if no matter how tough the circumstances get. But the amount of commercial farmers is dwindling. But there's also a lot of, on top of all the security and other problems, there's also economic issues coming to the fore when it comes to commercial farming. It increasingly becomes a mega farmer sector where it's no longer the days of starting a farm with a cow and a tractor. You have to be quite entrenched in farming to really get a foothold. You have to have, many farmers own more than one farm. It really is becoming an oligopoly, increasingly centralized in a smaller amount of farmers owning just a ridiculous amount of farms.
Well, having some familiarity and proximity to the farming community myself, there's, the idea of, people would often say, well, I'm just a dumb farmer. And I'm like, yeah, there's no such thing. You'll often see that.
You're a church council, you're an accountant. You're a scientist, you're a chemist, you're all these things at the same time.
you get into like council meetings at church, right? And you're like, I'm just a dumb farmer. What do I know? And I'm like, dude, you're a multi-millionaire. You sit on like how many thousand, like 1,000 acres of land. Your combine alone is worth $500,000. You know what I mean? And it's,
and your entire farm is a complex system that requires skill,
commodities, training. It just, so it's an enterprise, and you're
you don't just take seeds and you push them into the ground. So but that being said, I understand the element of concentration in economics and farming that way too, but it does create problems where, I guess, from a security perspective, because the farmers are spread out, they're vulnerable. It's not like you can, people can kind of hunker down in a neighborhood in Pretoria and defend themselves if they need be. But when you're out on the farms, you're very, very vulnerable. And that to me would seem to the sort of the big threat that way, is that you never really are in a position where you can make yourself totally secure. Yeah, well, like I say, there's a lot of complexity that's going on here in regards to this issue. There is the political side, there is the economic side, there is the social side. So in particular, the big pattern that we're seeing is increased concentration. Afrikaners moving away from rural areas, continuing to urbanize, and within rural areas moving into larger towns. So AfriForum is simply adjusting our strategy in accordance to that. You're not going to be able to change that pattern. You're not going to be able to manipulate that pattern. That is a force of nature that you're going up against, and you adjust your sails to that wind.
Yeah. And I guess for now, the task forward for AfriForum and the security network is do the best we can to protect ourselves, and then build the capacity in terms of social services, education, even like you say, power generation, road maintenance, all these other things, to allow ourselves to continue on with a fairly high degree of, a high functioning society within a decaying society.
Right. And you prioritize those areas where Afrikaners are concentrating organically, demographically.
Now, do you sense that a conflict may come to a head, or is that just too hard to predict at this point?
It's very hard to predict. I know that's a very entertaining topic that your audience will draw a lot of people into the audience, but I mean, it seems like a little bit of a futile endeavor. I'd rather be talking about the things that we know for certain and the things that we can do. South Africa, who was it? Jan Smuts, one of the previous Afrikaner leaders from the previous century, always said, South Africa is the place where the best case scenario never happens, but the worst case scenario also never happens. And I think that may be instrumental. And if you want to make a prediction for the future, I think there's a large chance that it just continues to slowly decay rather than one cataclysmic event erupting. But as I said, I don't indulge too much in predictions about the future.
Well, and that's, I think, from your perspective, that's a good way to look at it, because AfriForum's business is built around increasing capacity for the Afrikaner community. So if you stay focused on that, I think, the building a positive future.
Building our own institutions, building our own metaphorical life rafts. That's where our resources are going into. And I mean, there are two things that are absolutely certain for the future. I feel very confident making this prediction. The state capacity decay will continue for the foreseeable future. The state will become increasingly incapable, and the response to it will become increasingly capable. But the response from all three sides, private sector, profit-driven, and community-based, volunteer-driven, and organized crime, criminal-driven. That's going to become more prominent. Those two forces, the state going in one direction, in a direction of decay, and the counter strategies increasing in strength and complexity and prominence. Those two things are almost certain in my mind.
And it's interesting. Like it is very admirable that the Afrikaner community, for the most part, has said this is our home and we're going to stay. And so we're going to work on building capacity for ourselves, so that way we can lead the best possible lives that we can as a community.
Right. And while at the same time not being naive about the fact that there is going to be a large diaspora community, many Afrikaners will opt to leave. But we also have to be realistic about the fact that we can't survive as an exclusively diaspora community. There needs to be a cultural core in South Africa. So that's the existential question, is that if you are concerned about the survival of Afrikaner culture for the future, you better be doing everything in your capacity to ensure that there is a cultural core being built and a cultural foundation being built here at the southern tip of Africa. Because if we fail in that mission, the diaspora doesn't stand a chance existentially from a cultural perspective. They're not all going to die or live horrible lives, but they are going to, the culture itself and the language itself will fade. Their generations after them will no longer identify as Afrikaners. So that's the mission, is that we, while not being openly hostile or antagonistic towards those who choose to leave, those who have left also just need to grant us who choose to stay a certain level of understanding for why we are making this choice, because we don't have a choice. We have to ensure a cultural core here in South Africa for the Afrikaners, a home where Afrikaners can feel at home and where we can live out our culture, language, and religion freely. And that's the mission. That's what we're working towards. Whether we're going to succeed or fail, that's impossible to predict. But God knows if we will, and I'm also sure that we will.
The hope is wonderful to hear. Is there a sense, like, I know in the short term this is probably not the case, but is there a path forward where the various communities within South Africa could, in a sense, set aside the conflicts and work together for a better South Africa? Or is that just one of these things that just seems so remote that it's hard to even entertain what that would look like?
Well, most of the antagonism and most of the conflict in South Africa is top down. So it comes from the race obsessed elite and the anti-Afrikaner elite that are driving a lot of these narratives and a lot of the instability socially and politically. On the ground, race relations are still relatively good. I mean, I can walk around in the streets out there, be the only white person in the with my AfriForum shirt on, and I'm not going to be berated or attacked or spat on. But at the same time, it is also important to acknowledge that even if all politicians were to disappear tomorrow, that's not going to solve the problems and the frictions that exist in South Africa, because these conflicts and frictions are much older than the current dispensation. They are hundreds of years old. So that's also something to take into account, that while at the same time, I do think there are many solutions that different communities in South Africa can embark on to cooperate and work together very effectively, and that politicians are the way of a lot of these positive developments. Simply taking politicians and the political out of the equation, or the government out of the equation, is not going to solve the problem. It would maybe make the situation a lot better, but the problems that South Africa faces are a bit more deep-seated and deep than simply the current dispensation that we live under.
Yeah, so there's a path from where things are today to everybody's kind of kumbaya and let's all work together to create a better South Africa is something that is a long way off. And I know how that goes, is when you meet people face to face and interpersonally, it often can be hard at times to wonder conflicts come from. And then, I've talked about that with my wife, because we deal now with, the fallout of mass immigration here. And, most of the people that you meet interpersonally one-on-one, you often wonder like where are all the conflicts, and then you realize, but as you scale on aggregate, that's where the disputes tend to arise, is when you start dealing with the interests of that are, have histories and they're organized in that way.
Yeah, and another incredibly important ingredient in the recipe, flops or not, so is a success or not, is going to be whether Afrikaners can maintain powerful alliances with the other communities and peoples that we're with. We don't just need strong international friends, which increasingly are getting, which is fantastic to see. We are also building South Africa with many other cultures and groups that are not Afrikaners. And my colleague Ace is doing a lot of fantastic work on that front, but that's going to be critical. The age that we live in, no people can be an island, and Afrikaners that as well. So that's also going to be an incredibly important ingredient in the equation, is whether Afrikaners can build alliances. In fact, as America becomes more diverse, or whoever your group is in America, wherever you identify as your people, whether you can build strong alliances and other peoples in your country is going to be an incredibly and important factor as well. That's the nature of alliances. You can't just live alone. You can't just fortify an island and that's it. You're going to need friends. You're going to need allies. Central lessons that Afrikaners have learned as well.
I think, we could probably talk for hours and hours more. Busy time for you, given everything that's been happening.
I'll always put out to talk to you, Kryptos. It's always a fantastic enjoy and appreciate the curiosity and the attention that you grant Afrikaners as well. It's very valuable
to make those bridges and get the message out. I think we said when we started off, there are so many things that you where there are lessons to be learned in, and although entirely or even closely, I know higher degree of state competency, so that's a incompetent state, but at the same time there is a lot of the response, a lot of the community is, I think, instructive for people to understand what happens when you get beyond just it's all about the survival of us as a people, which is dynamic. And I think a lot of us here in the West, again, about the heart and core isn't just, it's where is the future of our people going to look like?
Yeah, when your politics and yours are increasingly.
Yeah, and then so a few places on this planet politics is greater than for the Afrikaner community. So it's and I always come away from these insights and appreciation. So again, thank you for your time. I really appreciate and the connections that we built from.
Very much for the opportunity, and God bless.
You too.